And good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's event at the East Hampton Library. Today we have Joan Baum with us, who will be giving a talk about The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. We will try to get to what it means to be Machiavellian at the end of the talk. Maybe. And without further ado, I'll turn over this evening's discussion to Joan Baum.
Thank you. Thanks to you, Steve. Thanks to all of you who have come here and to folks out there on Zoom. I am delighted to be able to talk about Machiavelli, and I'll explain, as I usually do, how I came to that subject. But I also want to thank my friend Fulvio Massi, who couldn't be here. Fulvio is a Florentinian, and I called him up to find out how I should properly pronounce Machiavelli's first name. Should it be Niccolo or Niccolo? Well, you know the answer, none of the above. The O at the end has an accent grave, top left, lower right, and that means that it's pronounced Niccolò. So I probably won't say that all the time, but I was delighted to find out that all these years I have been mispronouncing it. I'm going to also hold up a picture, which is the only picture that we know of Machiavelli. Maybe. Here he is. And you can see this online. Such a cutie. The picture was done by Santi de Tito. And I was curious, who was this Santi de Tito? And how accurate is the portrait? Oh boy. It turns out that Santi de Tito was born in 1536. Machiavelli died in 1527. And this famous picture is in the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. And so I wondered, who is this? Or how does he know that this is what Machiavelli looks like? Maybe. And I started asking around. Not hard to do in this community of artists. No one knew. And so what I finally did, and I thoroughly recommend always writing to authors or people you're engaged with literature. I wrote to the editor of the little edition that I have, the Penguin Classic. His name is Tim Parks, and he lives in London. And I asked him, and he said, who knows whether that's really what Machiavelli looks like? First of all, artists would only do famous people, and Machiavelli was certainly famous, even though he was dead. I've seen likenesses of him in profile on coins, which look nothing like I would imagine the face would suggest. And that was about the answer. When you have someone famous you're doing, you will look around, there probably will be a coin or two with the likeness. And then there will be people who remember him. No, you haven't got the eyes right. Whatever, this is still what we hold up as the representation. And he looks so sweet. I love that. And so Niccolò di Bernardo del Machiavelli is the full name. The reason for the talk. It's probably related to the reason I gave a talk on George Orwell, as I got tired of hearing people talk about events as Orwellian. And when Eric Trump finally did, I had it. So here we are with Machiavellian, and it's unique because it's an adjective. And it's an adjective that at least everyone seems to agree means cunning, scheming, cruel, devious. A wonderful essay in the New Yorker several years ago on Machiavelli said, and I quote, "Whenever a sovereign usurped power from the church or the nobility, whenever ostentatious deceit or murderous force was used, Machiavelli was spied in the shadows, scribbling at his desk amid the olive groves, his quill dipped in a poison so potent that it threatened the power structures of Europe." Let me say that it was a prompt then to read The Prince, and I don't agree. I have become, crazy as it sounds, a fan, or at least I found the book provocative enough to start thinking of what we all might agree are terrible things that perhaps in the world of realpolitik, Kissinger just died a few months ago, make sense. Anyway, yes, Machiavelli advocated behavior that was cruel, ends justifying the means, and at times cruelty, pretense, instilling fear. But the people who quote these do so out of context, and I suspect a context that they're not familiar with anyway. And they're also out of context of what life was like in the Renaissance. Read Shakespeare. Machiavelli, unlike some of the thugs of the world today, knew languages, knew history, and was a historian. In fact, that would be the better term for him. He was a learned man. And as I read The Prince, I found him reasonable in argument, which I didn't expect. He gives examples always of what he believes. And what he believes, he doesn't always stick with. The model for the prince, the character on which he was thinking, who had died before the book was finished, was Cesare Borgia. No sweetie pie that. Used to cut up his victims and hang them out for everyone to see. But Machiavelli thought he was a superb leader. He died at 31. How could he say that? Well, he admired the qualities and the behavior of Borgia, while also admitting something that rarely gets said along with Machiavelli, that there were two important standards for him by which to judge a ruler. One, character. Two, fortune, luck. And it was at least 50% of the time. So I liked what I read. I liked reading someone who seemed reasonable. And I'm going to get to the problem of how do you know, because I'm reading a translation. He also had Republican sympathies. He came from a distinguished family, but they weren't rich. And he was, for most of his life, a Medici man. And we forget that Lorenzo the Magnificent was an incredibly powerful ruler who superintended probably the greatest art in Western civilization. Machiavelli adored him, but somehow it was rumored that he was planning some kind of a coup. I mean, everybody was always planning a coup, and everybody was always at war with everyone. And so he wound up on the wrong side of the Medicis and actually was in prison for a while, where he suffered the indignity, but also severe pain of something called the strappado, where you hang someone up by hands tied behind their back and drop them on the floor. Savonarola, who came in briefly while the Medicis were out, was dropped 14 times and finally died. Surprisingly, from what I've read, Machiavelli was dropped 6 times. And remember that because after he gets out, he writes to the Medici family and doesn't mention that at all, which is amazing. He was a womanizer and also a poet. I certainly don't know anything about him as a writer of sex comedies, but from what I've read, that's how his popularity started. He was a man's man. He not only was a womanizer, however, he dallied with men at times. No surprise in the Renaissance, especially when you remember that, to me, the two greatest artists of all time, Leonardo and Michelangelo, were gay. Leonardo flamboyantly so. And here's something that I also took away from the book. I think he was an honest man, even though he was an honest man saying, hey, if you have to do it, lie. But he never denied it. He was in foreign affairs, diplomatic sense, for 40 years. And he seems to have done so as honestly as anyone could, as he proudly proclaimed, though this is apocryphal, my poverty is witness to my loyalty and honesty. So here's The Prince. It's dedicated to Your Highness, and a lot of people think it was Lorenzo the Magnificent, the great Medici. But he died in 1492. The book is actually dedicated to the grandson, Lorenzo di Piero de' Medici, who didn't particularly have any kind of intellectual head about it, probably didn't read it at all. And it's of no significance. But the question to ask is, what's the big deal about the book? So he dedicates a book about power to the reigning monarch. So what? When you read it, and I hope you do at least in part, you will see that probably, if you've ever read before that in politics, or even Greek philosophy, theory of politics and theories of ethics were always united. Not so with The Prince. It is really the beginning, and it may be the end, of a treatise that clearly separates political expression and morality. And that's something to mull over. And I thought of that this morning when, like you, I listened to the news and hear once again about charges that international rules of war are being abrogated. And they will, Machiavelli would have said, are you kidding? I mean, I wouldn't even discuss that. So he really is, when you think of it, the father of a discipline that's become very popular today, political science. But political science as politics, not as ethics and morality. And it's interesting because, to me, here is a guy who is Machiavellian. He lends his name to an adjective that's well used, and yet he founded, and nothing was founded from him, any political school. There is no Machiavellian philosophy, no Machiavellian series of policies or procedures or processes. You can talk about Plato, and you talk about the Platonic school, and we know, well, we're not going to go into that now, what that refers to, or Aristotle, or Thomas More, utopian, but not Machiavelli. And that may be why the book is so peculiar, because it is sui generis, one of its kind. Of course, I was curious about whether my edition editor, Tim Parks, thought that Putin read Machiavelli, the prince. And I wrote to him, do that. They answer. He wrote back and he said, he may well have a frightening thought. Well, perhaps, but when you read The Prince and go over some of the advocacies, you'll find that Putin violated them. Number one, about an army and how to conduct a war. Nothing would have made more significance to Machiavelli than that. He wrote The Prince when he was 44, having survived the strappado, and he was eager to get back in the game. He had been in diplomatic work for years, and he missed it. So he decided to write a book, a monograph, really. And you have to remember that he was tortured. He was falsely accused, it seems. He's now living on a farm with his wife and kids, and he's bored and he misses the action. And so what you have here is the prince with a wonderful introductory letter. Though this gift is no doubt unworthy of you, I feel sure the experience it contains will make it welcome, especially when you think that I could hardly offer anything better than the chance to grasp in a few hours what I have discovered and assimilated over many years of danger and discomfort. Rulers are always being given presents, horses, jewelry, whatever finery seems appropriate. He's going to do something better. He's going to give the ruler his experience, his smarts, and his life. And what an absolutely ingenious thing to do. He could have sought vengeance. He could have cried, in a way, rhetorically. But what he does is, in effect, write a job application. This is what I've done. I'm laying it out for you. Do it. And if you need assistance, you know where you can turn. It really is a wonderful idea to preface to the prince. So please take, Your Highness, the small gift in the spirit in which it is given. And that spirit is a little bit ambivalent. And as I said, probably the grandson didn't read it, but it's part of the Machiavellian mystique that he would turn his misery, his unhappiness into a job application. Boy, have I learned it. And boy, do you want to know it. It is clever. But what a time he lived in, because I think it's important to consider that when we take into account his cruelty and some of the more dubious recommendations. It was the era of Gutenberg, so we have mass dissemination of material. Machiavelli was 15 years younger than Leonardo, 6 years older than Michelangelo, 25 years younger than Botticelli. He was living and writing right in the middle of the Reformation. He was 22 years older than Henry VIII, who was on the throne from 1509 to 1547. And it's said he read The Prince. I think he probably did. English Anglo-Catholics hated Machiavelli, and he was seen as the villain inspiring Henry VIII to defy papal authority. Well, the book was put on the index along with all Machiavelli's works briefly in 1559, 30 years after his death, so he didn't care. But it was too late. People were reading it. And Tim Parks, my editor here of the book, mentions 400 times in Elizabethan drama where Machiavelli was referred to in English theater as the murderous Machiavelli. He was a threat to the church. Now, I've mentioned my edition and the fact that I wrote to the editor, Tim Parks. Those of you who have heard me yap before know one of my no-nos is translations. I don't review them. I don't know what I get. And there are so many new translations that come out. The Iliad, the Odyssey, and War and Peace, for starters, and probably finishers. But this book was written in a style, Tim Parks says, that could be understood by an Italian today. It's written in the Florentine dialect. And we're reminded that when we talk about Machiavelli or anything Italian, there was no Italy. There was no Italy until 1871, 76. The largest of the various states, the city-states, was Naples, but there were so many others. Milan, Genoa, Venice, Pisa, and to my understanding, the Italians I meet today are very quick to say where they're from and to cite their culture and particularly their food as unique. But what he shows, and it is kind of detailed, heavy reading in part, although the language and the structure are very simple. These states were always warring with one another. It was constant. And when they weren't warring with each other, or wrong, let me retract that. They were warring with each other and at the same time warring with outside armies invading from France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire of Germanic nations, always. And one of the exhausting and depressing facts you come away with reading The Prince is that's it. That's what life and civilization are. War. It is constant. Even when in the 19th century science and art became to claim interest of writers as histories, there was always war backing it, interfering, and it's constant. In fact, I can think of no other synonym for civilization that is as constant as war. And therefore, if Machiavelli spends his time saying that the most important thing a ruler must do is know his military, it wasn't because he was a maniac. It was because he knew what was essential. And the ruler must have a strong army. And rulers must be experts in the art of war, which means they should study it. And I don't know how many people would qualify for that today. I do know that Putin has been violating number one rule in this advocacy of Machiavelli of using mercenaries. Machiavelli gives a very strong argument about why using mercenaries is dangerous to the ruler. They can't be trusted. And now Putin has opened up the prisons. Machiavelli would say the same thing. He also said that a ruler, everybody is always conquering everybody else. So it's nothing surprising. But when you do, he said, the ruler, you better do one of two things. You better go and live in the country you're conquering and get to know it, or else you're going to get a revolution immediately. Or if you don't want to do that, devastate the country totally and do it fast. Dribbling is a Machiavellian sin. Now, a lot of this is hard to, speaking of dribbling, swallow, but I want you to think about this because he's no, to me, dangerous maniac. These are very thoughtful expressions. And what absolutely surprised me as I was reading on, I would get to a paragraph where he would say, and you know, I've given you all these examples from Roman times, from medieval times, but maybe it's not so. Or maybe luck comes and the ruler has to be able to move and pivot fast and change. And maybe that's why Machiavelli didn't spawn a school. He's no ideologue. He's partisan, he's smart, but he's analytical, and he doesn't hold to a whole bunch of rules that suddenly will ease out. Now, I mentioned my reluctance to do anything in translation. That was the only way I was going to get to do this. And I love this little book. It's something to cuddle and hold. And you can't read him on your iPhone. He was not Ciceronian elegant. The language, and I think Parks has done a terrific job. And what swayed me to use this edition was that I liked the introduction of the editor. He says, so, what am I doing that other best-selling translations think they're doing just as well, if not better? Well, let me give you an example. And he has whole sections where he has his translation set against the others. And I was impressed. He does this not once, but constantly. And he also does something that I think was extremely important and that I really haven't read about that much until I got to him. He says that, of course, there are translation problems, but they're not one translation versus another. They're appreciating the fact that certain words today carry meanings that they didn't in Machiavelli's day. And the most important word of all is virtue. And it comes from the Latin vir, V-I-R, which means man. It has nothing to do with morality. And people are angry at him because he's not virtuous in that sense. Well, he doesn't want to be. He doesn't have to be, and he shouldn't be. He is talking about the word. It's mentioned about 60 times in The Prince. And it's mentioned in a context, I was thinking of what might be a good synonym: effectiveness, efficacy, anything that allowed a ruler to exercise his intellect freely. What's the opposite of virtue? Luck. Fortune, as it's well known. And Machiavelli follows leaders, and his leaders are virtuous, and therefore they can kill, therefore they can torture. Folks, read the papers, not unique. And do so, and I think this is key and dangerous, but key, do so without tears. There is no such thing to Machiavelli as a virtuous war. There is no such thing as humane torture, degrees of torture. He would scoff at the amount that we spend talking about the morality of certain military expeditions depending on the degree of the torture. I just finished reviewing a wonderful book called James by Percival Everett, which is a reimagining of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn from the point of view of Jim, the slave, who's now James. And if there's one theme that emerges from that book, which is also, by the way, very funny, it's that what is the torture of a slave who undergoes rape once or 10 times? How many lashes is a good master allowed to do? 5? Oh, not 25. That certainly is wrong. But that's the way people argued about the plantation life. They made degrees instead of kind the subject. And Machiavelli would have none of it. His man, his virtuous man, was courageous and valiant and cared not just about winning, but about glory. And that was an important consideration as well. So it has nothing to do, his virtue, with good or evil, only success or failure. And as he writes in The Prince, there are 2 qualities that go into constituting Vere. One, he must be resourceful, cunning, like a fox, but he also has to be brave and powerful, like a lion. And you can't have one without the other. So what is this book? It's not a memoir. It is addressed to a ruler. It's a guidebook. It's a how-to. Is he describing? Is he recommending? Both. It's a book of advice. It has 26 short chapters about how to wield but hold on to power, and how to behave when bad luck comes and the worst rulers just collapse. The good ones, even his own bad luck, as I said, being, in prison and all that, he comes out and he says, "Hi, I'd like a job with you," in effect. Spinoza saw the book as a cautionary tale about how power really worked. Bertrand Russell, the famous mathematician, philosopher, thought it might be satirical. And I've had some people write to me and say, "Is it a satire?" No, but he thought it was a handbook satirical for gangsters. So he wasn't really serious. Mussolini saw it as a guidebook and did read it. At the time, there was a genre, you might call it the mirror for princes. Look in the mirror, what kind of a ruler are you? And here is a way of strengthening what you should be doing. And in a way, it reminded me of the early books that came out in the late Middle Ages with these little prefatory notes, "Go little book," in Latin. And in a way, this one says the same thing, "Go little book," this little guidebook. And princes, you'll be on the right side when you do this. So he wasn't an ideologue. He wasn't a visionary, wasn't an idealist. It's okay, he says, to be hated if you're virtuous. The ends justify the means, but the ends include glory for the people and for the country, not just for the ruler. And in fact, he makes it very clear. There's a wonderful section, "Rulers, beware flatterers." Winning is important, but watch out. A ruler won't be hated, Machiavelli says, if he keeps his hands off other people's property in his own domain and women, well, not to worry, neither one held, but the important lesson got through. It comes out at a time, as I said, when everybody is conquering territory. And it's hard to do and it's hard to keep. So in order to get a secure hold on new territories, he writes, one need eliminate the surviving members of the family of their previous rulers. And I thought to myself, Shakespeare must have taken that right out from Macbeth, because one of the most hideous parts of Macbeth is when he decides to kill Macduff and all those children. You know, oh my God, how are they going to secure that on film? And they don't. Fortune varies, but men go on regardless. I have this little book, I have to use it. Everybody loathes the barbarous occupations, so you may, noble house, undertake this duty with the spirit and hope that inspires just causes, so that our country may be glorified under your banner and under your protection. That's wonderful. And as I read that, I said, my God, did I just read the word hope from Machiavelli? Yes. And so people who pull out of context what they want as though it's exclusive and only true are not reading him carefully. I think he certainly advocated cruelty, and he says cruelty can be used badly or well. Get the violence over immediately. People will be less hostile. And dribble favors to the conquered people slowly. You do it too fast, they'll lose respect for you and think you're weak. And for those of us who go around, as I, hoping for peace, whenever I see people now with peace symbols or signing letters, peace, I think, what would Big Mac think? Well, we know what he would think. If a ruler wants to survive, he has to learn to stop being good, especially when occasion demands power. And then perhaps the most serious thing of all, people are not good. In his day, when these mirrors for princes came out, one of the most famous was by Erasmus, The Making of a Christian Prince. And what is the best thing a Christian prince should do? What is the ultimate goal? Be an advocate of Christ. I believe that Machiavelli was an atheist. Want to soften it up a bit? That's okay. But he didn't deal, as I said, realpolitik is a wonderful word, although it was, I think, first used in the 19th century and then endlessly by Kissinger. But aside from that, he looked at the way things were, not as people wanted them to be. And I have found myself now reading accounts in the newspaper after hearings, after meetings, after protests, people being interviewed. Everybody has a future reference in mind. Machiavelli would have despised that. Here's the problem. Here it is now. What are you going to do? And the cliche and the jargon of all these familiar feel-good, let's trust in God, would have disturbed him as unreal and dangerous to the country. Should rulers keep their promises? Well, it's not nice to admire somebody who says, no, not necessarily. They should be, let's put a nice spin on it, adaptable. And they must be smart. In fact, in the book, he mentions that King Ferdinand of Spain, you remember him from Columbus, did his country a terrible disservice by expelling Jews, taking their property, taking their professional expertise, and throwing them out. He says, one of the stupidest moves of all of a ruler. So what are the takeaways that I'd like to leave you with before I finally keep quiet and open this up for comments and questions that I probably have no answers to? Read the book. That sounds silly, but too many of us read what other people say about a book, which is fine, but read it first. And if it's a book in translation, take some time to wonder whose it is, what the background is, and what the motives may be. I am impressed, and obviously I want you to be too, with the fact that Machiavelli views the world as a world without morality. It doesn't mean that it's a world without ethics or a world where people can't get together and decide on goodness. But the idea, and he particularly means organized religion, of people fighting because they want to go to heaven and they're sure they'll get there, he says is just an absolute distraction. There is today, a critic has said, I don't know if this is true, a school of political philosophers who see Machiavelli as an intellectual freedom fighter, a transmitter of models of liberty from the ancient to the modern world. I don't know. I believe him, however, when he says in The Prince, I love my country more than my own soul. And I'd like to close by reading the last few lines of The Prince. He's talking about a ruler being barbarous, if need be, but also working toward glory. And if so, he hopes that Petrarch's words will be achieved. And he ends this book on war, this book of seemingly advocating viciousness and violence. He ends it with Petrarch's words. We want virtue against fury. It shall take up arms, and the fight be short. For ancient valor is not dead in Italian hearts. And the fact that he ends with the words of a poet, a humanist, and in a previous sentence has used the word hope, I think rounds out and complements what I do believe has been a false image of a very wise, difficult, cynical, but knowledgeable man. Thank you very much. And now, and no questions about contemporary news, but I'd like to hear from you. We all somehow think we've read parts of this book, but we really haven't. You can slip over some of the accumulation of incredible examples from Roman time. I mean, he wrote things besides The Prince. He was a historian and he was very learned. But you get the gist of it, and I trust the editor in the simplicity. For example, what I just read was so simple, and everything I read that he wrote was simple and acceptable and available. And I hope you dip in.
We
And I
have
hope,
we have a few questions from the
Okay.
folks at home.
okay.
Lots of comments, lots of thank yous, an excellent presentation. One person asks, what is Machiavelli's description of glory?
Vision. Oh, I'm sorry. Probably the number one definition he would give is of unity, of the coming together of warring factions to make a solid country that could enjoy power and expertise. And as I said, I was stunned when I read the word Italian because that in itself was a clever little move because there was no Italy to Victor Emmanuel. Ah, thank you. Yes.
Must have looked this up.
No, he didn't. Stayed on his farm. And, once you're out of power, you're out. There are just too many hungry people, foaming at the mouth. But what he did was better. He got a bigger job as the author of an incredibly influential treatise.
We didn't believe in organizers. Did he have any religious affiliations at
Well,
all?
everyone was a Catholic, but I don't think
He didn't live it or believe it or follow Christ.
Watch the Medicis on Netflix, or, just read anything. The popes particularly. Yes. Sir?
I'm wondering if the version that you read was annotated or whether you were, reading something and then running to the internet to kind of fill in the information.
I ran to the internet, nada. It's whatever I read was straight from here. And there is an extended, it's a good question, Jeff. Whatever I read was part of an introduction as well. I mean, the author, obviously, how can you spend so much of your life working on someone you don't like? And that's about what happened to me. I wound up liking him, loving him. Other comments? Yes.
Tony, what would he make of someone like Churchill,
Oh.
who often is considered by Churchill? How would he?
I'm loath to answer that question because one, I don't know. But two, you could ask that about everyone. There are people who do think that Putin is Machiavellian. I don't know. And I don't know that much about Churchill's war strategies. And since that was the subject, really, of The Prince, rather than the statesman that Churchill has become for most of us, we can't really cite what decisions, unless we're Churchillians, what decisions.
Well, we've all seen the Lords of Arabia.
You're right. I don't know what Peter O'Toole would have thought either. It was a good question. It was published. I don't know what the delay was, but it was published 5 years after he had finished writing it in 1513. But he loved writing it, obviously, and it's very well organized. It's a very good question. I've never frankly, I'm not a Strapato fan, or I don't know, but I would think, I mean, everybody was was dropped, who was anybody in politics. I don't know. It's a good question. He wrote Livy histories. He also wrote poems. And Celia, what else did he write? The Republic. Right. He was. And not like Plato's Republic, of course, where again, people used to divide themselves when I went to school between Platonists and Aristotelians. And it had to do with how realistic you were or how ideal and visionary. I don't know that, I would think that clearly Machiavelli would be in the Aristotelian camp, an empiricist, a man who drew his experiences from his own life and observations and readings. And probably Aristotle, more than anyone else, got it right in the most concise way that would have pleased Machiavelli. What is man? He is a rational animal. Nouns count for more than adjectives. So there's the animal. And by rational, it didn't mean what people have interpreted it to mean. Capable of moral and ethical judgments. It meant rationalization. It meant the capacity to reason, cognitive ability. And pretty much that's what Aristotle was saying, that behind the art of war, there is man who is only a rational animal. Maybe according to other people in other climes, there will be a difference, but not for him. And I think, again, if I may preach, you say no, but I say it's my turn. The realism that he brought to me, it's a hard realism, and the separation of morality from politics is an extremely difficult consideration, but consider it, and consider it under his aegis of saying there may be a greater humanity coming to terms with what we're doing and how we're doing it and how we might hope to prevent it in the future.
We have a question from the folks at home. Was the book influential in Machiavelli's time, and did he become popular?
Well, the book certainly became popular, and it became popular, first of all, by the anti-papists who loved it. And it was put on the index. I suppose that made it very popular. But it's a monograph, and it was read. And he was well known. And the book grew in stature. As I said, by quoting Tim Parks, the editor, in Elizabethan drama, whenever you wanted to have someone evil, you referred to Machiavelli. So in England, not for a while, but I think certainly by the 19th century, when realpolitik, became a reality in politics, the book certainly attracted attention. But again, the irony is there are no followers. There's no school. He is one of a kind, and I think that's terrific. Yes. The Catholic Index. Don't read this book. Bad. And in fact, all of his books, briefly. I mean, anybody was on the index. James Joyce. Yes. An excellent question. I don't know. I did write, as I said, to the editor and asked about Putin. If I were a leader, I wouldn't admit to that. I would just read the book and start taking notes. But I wouldn't let on that there's a history here and in an argument that's been pretty well supported. And again, false or not, such a sweet face.
Thank you. Thank you, Joan. Thank you, everybody, for attending and for the folks at home for zooming in. And we'll see you at the next presentation.